Good afternoon. My name is Molly Bumpas, and I am really happy to be here with you all talking about the power of positive reinforcement strategies for teaching young children. A little bit about me. I have been working in the field of autism for about 20 years. First as a speech language pathologist, and then with the addition of being a behavior analyst. And currently, I serve as an early childhood services coordinator at SD Associates in Williston, Vermont. So let's get started. And please feel free to ask questions, or if I use some jargon or something that doesn't make sense. There's a lot of jargon in this field. Please feel free to ask me to translate for you. I will do my best to translate as we go along. So the first question is, in general, what is ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis? And it's a set of procedures that are used to teach new skills and reduce problem behaviors by replacing them with more socially acceptable behaviors. And I think what's important to remember about ABA is that it's not a certain tool. It's a science. It's a wide field. It's used from everything to teaching young children, to organizational behavior management, to dealing with addiction, to all sorts of things. So it's a very wide science, and it's not just something that we use for kids to teach them new skills. ABA applies scientifically demonstrated principles and concepts of behavior analysis to make meaningful changes in the lives of individuals and groups. And I think the meaningful changes is very important here, because it takes a lot of work to change behavior. So we want to make sure whatever those behaviors are that we are increasing in kids and teaching them are meaningful and socially significant and are going to make an impact in their lives and their ability to access all different kinds of settings and experiences. And I just said this, but I'll say it again. It's important to remember that ABA is a science, and it's not one specific program or technique. It's a very broad field that includes a range of tactics and has been shown to be effective across many different populations. So what do we mean by behavior? When I say the word behavior, I don't mean something good or something bad. Behavior I'm going to use in a very value neutral way. Basically, behavior is anything that an individual does. So it could be talking to another person, hitting someone on the arm, eating a piece of cake, crying, writing your name. All of these things are behaviors. In ABA, we have something called the dead man's test. And what that means is if a dead man can do it, it is not behavior. So anything else we consider to be a behavior. And behaviors serve a function. So as behavior analysts, we determine the function that a behavior serves for a child. All behaviors occur for a reason. Sometimes the reason's really clear. Sometimes it's not so clear. Some behaviors are socially desired and other behaviors are not socially desired. So when we look at the function of behavior, there's in general 4 common functions that we look for. The first one is to either escape or avoid a situation. The second would be attention seeking. The third would be gaining access to materials or activities. And the fourth would be what we call automatic reinforcement, or behavior that's not socially mediated. So it's truly done for the own individual's purpose. It's something that they enjoy doing. And you can tell it's an automatically reinforcing behavior if it occurs even when the child is alone. So something you may think of for kids on the autism spectrum would be self-stimulatory behavior. Flapping. So the child may flap when they're with other people. They may flap when they're happy. They may flap when they're sad. They may flap when they're all by themselves. So that would be an automatically reinforcing behavior for them. So when we're looking at how to use reinforcement and other tools to increase behaviors that we want to see increase, we really have to be a behavior detective and understand why a challenging behavior is occurring. This is a crucial piece that sometimes gets missed. We hear about functional behavior assessments, FBAs has become sort of a big buzzword, especially in Vermont in the schools. But it is for a good reason, because it's really important to pinpoint why a challenging behavior is occurring in order to select an appropriate intervention. If a child is acting out because they want to leave the classroom, then they need a replacement behavior. They need to learn how to ask for a break in an appropriate manner. Okay, so we always want to look at what's the replacement behavior that we need to teach this child to replace a challenging behavior, because all these behaviors are occurring for a reason. And myself being a speech language pathologist and a behavior analyst, this is really my core belief right here, is that communication and challenging behavior are connected, that you can't really have communication without behavior and vice versa. So often if a challenging behavior is present, the replacement behavior is going to involve teaching a child to communicate something that they want or need. So we always want to look at what are they trying to communicate through this behavior, and how can we help give them a more appropriate functional way to do that. So if we have a kiddo come in for treatment, the first goal in therapy is to find a functional communication system for them. That is the core, primary, most important thing for all humans, I think, is that right to be able to communicate. So that would be the first goal that I would have for a child coming in for treatment. So we often look at behaviors going in two different directions. You want to have your behaviors that you want to increase. This may be things like being able to communicate, being able to follow directions, being able to eat a variety of foods, whatever it may be for a certain kiddo. And then there's behaviors to decrease, which may be things like non-compliance, or having a tantrum because it's time to sit down and eat dinner, those kinds of things. So we look at the behaviors going in two different directions. And when you're making a plan, especially if you look at school behavior support plans, sometimes I see plans that have only behaviors to decrease, and that's a red flag right there. You should always have more behaviors to increase than you do decrease in a behavior support plan. If all you have are behaviors to decrease, then I would ask the question, what are we teaching the child? What are we replacing these behaviors with? They need to learn skills, not just get rid of behaviors, but learn new, more appropriate behaviors. Okay, so when we're talking about behavior, we also need to learn about the ABCs. And the ABCs would be three words here. We have antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. Antecedents are just what it sounds like, events that occurred immediately before the behavior began. Behavior, remember, is that anything a person says or does. And then the consequences would be the events that immediately followed the behavior. So your antecedents, your behavior, and then your consequences. When we talk about positive reinforcement in a little bit, that is going to be under a consequence. Okay, and this is just looking at it in a different kind of visual. The antecedent comes first, then the behavior, and then the consequence. And when you're doing a functional behavior assessment, or really observing and looking at behavior, this is how we're breaking it down. This is how we're taking data around these three occurrences so that we can analyze it and see what's happening right before, what's happening right after. And based on that, we may have an antecedent-based intervention, or a consequence-based intervention, or a combination of both. Okay, so let's break this down in an example that sort of makes sense. So your antecedent may be your phone rings. The behavior, you answer your phone, say hello. The consequence would be that a friend talks to you. So in this instance, I would say that that consequence is a positive reinforcer for you because you like talking to your friend. Therefore, when your phone rings again, you are more likely to pick it up because of the experience you just had of talking to your friend. To put it another way, your phone rings, you answer your phone and say hello, and it's the credit card company because you haven't paid your credit card bill for many months. I would say that consequence is more of a punisher for you. So you are less likely to answer your phone the next time it rings because of that experience that you just had when you answered your phone. So this is a really simple kind of example, but it's exactly the way you look at what could be happening for a child who's emitting certain behaviors. What are those consequences? Are they reinforcing the behavior? Are they punishing the behavior? What's happening there? Okay, another example. So Johnny's mom wants him to eat bananas, but Johnny does not like bananas. So mom gives him a bowl of bananas every day at lunchtime. When she puts the bowl on the table, Johnny picks it up and throws it on the floor. Mom then gives Johnny yogurt, which he quickly eats because he loves yogurt. Okay, so what just really happened there? If we break down our ABCs, the antecedent, what happened first? She presented him a bowl of bananas. Behavior, he dumped the bowl of bananas on the floor. Consequence, mom gave him a bowl of yogurt. So we would say that Johnny, the function of his behavior is to gain access to that yogurt. So he's learned if he throws bananas on the floor, he doesn't have to eat them, and he will instead get to eat yogurt. So what is he going to do next time? He's going to continue to throw his bananas on the floor because that yogurt is a reinforcer for that behavior. So by changing what we do immediately before or after a behavior, we can often change the behavior. Okay, just a few more things about antecedents, or those things that happen before a behavior occurs. One of the big pieces of behavior is motivation. So the chain of events always starts with the motivation. We are all motivated to do certain things or not to do certain things. Motivational states that we could have, some of them are biological, like hunger or thirst. If we're thirsty, we're more motivated to take a drink of water. Painful or pleasant sensations, fatigue is a motivator as well. If we're feeling too hot or too cold, if we've had too much or too little of something. So if I just ate a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, then having a chocolate bar right then may not be a reinforcer for me at that point in time because I am satiated on sweets. However, at another point in time, a chocolate bar may be a really, really big reinforcer for me. So those pieces of motivation can have to do with also other pieces that are going on for us in that moment in time. Setting events would include things like the physical setting or activity or interactions that will also increase the likelihood that particular behaviors will occur. So places where things might happen, home or at a store in the community or at school. Sometimes you see kiddos who have a certain behavior in the school environment that the family never sees happen at home, right? So that school has become a setting event for that particular behavior. Or it could be an activity setting event. So if I'm driving in heavy traffic and someone cuts me off, that may be a setting event for me to start yelling or using words that I wouldn't typically use in another setting. Or if you're sitting down at the dinner table to eat, that may be a setting event for actually eating food, is sitting down at that table. And then there's also interactional variables that come in for children and for all of us all the time. So if before I got to work this morning, I dropped my work bag and all of my files just fell out all over the floor and got dirty outside in the rain. That's a setting event for me, that when I come into work and something else comes at me, I may have a quicker temper than normal that morning because that setting event has already put me in that place of being frustrated. So as you can see, there's a lot going on here that's going into play for kids and for all of us all the time. Consequences. So like the term behavior we talked about is value neutral. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just behavior. It's objective. Consequences the same way. You often hear, there will be consequences. That makes it sound like consequences is a negative thing, but that's not how I mean it here. Consequences are not bad things that happen. All consequences in this context are things that happen after a behavior occurs. Those are the consequences. And when we talk about consequences in ABA, there are 5 categorical types of consequences. The first being positive reinforcement, which we will talk more about. Negative reinforcement, which is not good nor bad, as you'll see. Positive punishment, negative punishment, and then our 5th friend, extinction, which we'll talk a little bit about later as well. And I know this is a kind of a technical slide here, but it's really, I think it's the best way to talk about what's going on for each of these situations. So here are 4 of our categories. We have our positive reinforcement, our negative reinforcement, our positive punishment, and negative punishment. And when you see positive and negative on this slide, again, it's value neutral. It does not mean good or bad. All it means is positive, as you can see by the plus sign above that column there, means that there's something being added to the environment. Something is being added. The negatives under the negative column means something's being taken away. Okay, so positive means something's being added, negative means something's being taken away. So for example, positive reinforcement, and now if we go rows, the first row, which is the reinforcement row, what reinforcement means is that that consequence increases the frequency of the desirable behavior. Punishment row means that consequence decreases the frequency of the undesirable behavior. So for example, positive reinforcement. You get into the checkout line with your toddler at the grocery store. The toddler is whining because they want a candy bar. Mom buys candy for the toddler so that they'll be quiet. What happens next time you go to the checkout line? The toddler's going to whine again, right? So that was positive reinforcement. The candy bar was given, which is why it was positive, because something was given and the behavior increased. Okay, positive reinforcement. An example of negative reinforcement would be your alarm goes off in the morning, you hit stop on the snooze button, which is the behavior, and the alarm noise stops. So the noise was removed. So there's your negative. Something was taken away, and the behavior of hitting the snooze button is going to increase because it made that noise stop. That was reinforcing, so your behavior is going to increase. Another example of negative reinforcement, there are carrots on the kiddo's plate. The child screams when they see the carrots, and the plate of carrots is taken away. Next time the child sees carrots on their plate, they're going to scream. Why? Because when they screamed, something was removed. The carrots were removed. So that behavior of screaming is going to increase. That is negative reinforcement. Behavior still went up, and the only difference is something was given or something was taken away. Thank you for bearing with me. I know this is really, this part is always confusing. And then when we look at punishment, positive punishment, so something is given. So you tell children to play nicely. Your kiddos are fighting. You tell everyone they need to play nicely. They continue to fight. So then everyone has to do a chore. Okay, something was added. That stimulus of having to do a chore, that consequence was added. The behavior of the fighting behavior decreases. So the behavior decreased when something was added. That's positive punishment. Negative punishment, John's late for his curfew. His parents ground him. John's not late for curfew again. So he was grounded. So his rights of going out were removed, and that decreased the frequency of undesirable behavior, which would be being late. Okay, so basically, you can see there's a lot going on when we're analyzing consequences. And what I want to make the point of today is that really positive reinforcement is the best tool that we have in order to change kiddos' behavior, and it should always be our first attempt as an intervention, should always be positive reinforcement. So this slide, it says, so you say his behavior keeps getting worse, then why do you continue to provide the same consequence? And I have this conversation with myself as a parent all the time. There's something that my child's doing that I want to get them to stop doing, and I continually provide the same consequence, and their behavior doesn't change. So in that instance, I'm not doing a very good job of analyzing the function, seeing that my consequence is not working, the behavior is not going in the direction I want it to. And I often think that this is the definition of insanity. You're doing the same thing over and over again with the same consequences. So positive reinforcement is really the consequence that I want us to focus on. So let's just talk about that for a minute. What is reinforcement and why is it so important? So reinforcement, as we just talked about, is a consequence that increases the future probability of a behavior. It can involve the presentation of items, activities, or attention. So something is given. That's why we have the positive in there. And we use this type of reinforcement to teach children a variety of important skills. And Cooper, Heron, and Heward here are sort of some of the bigwigs and wrote the seminal textbook in applied behavioral analysis. And this is taken from them. It says positive reinforcement is the most important and most widely applied principle of behavior analysis. And I wholeheartedly agree. Because the behavior goes where the reinforcement flows. This is how we have the most powerful tool to change behavior. And the fact that reinforcement affects everybody. It affects all of us. It occurs often throughout your life through natural consequences. For example, the consequence of going to work is getting a paycheck. This reinforcement increases the likelihood that you will keep going to work. In the same way, challenging behaviors are learned through their relationship to reinforcement. So a child will learn to engage in a problem behavior if he regularly receives reinforcement for doing so. In other words, the behavior is working for that child in some way. They are getting their needs met through that behavior. So for example, often with toddlers may go through a period of biting other kids, biting parents. That biting behavior produces a lot of attention. People say no, people get animated, people get loud, people get upset. Even though it's negative attention, it's still a lot of attention. And for some kiddos, that's reinforcing because maybe they like to get a lot of attention. So they're going to keep going back to that biting because it's reinforcing for them. The big reaction is reinforcing for them. In the same way, if you have a kid in class who is interrupting a lot, they may get sent to the office. Maybe the function of that interrupting behavior was to escape and avoid having to be in class. So if you're sending them to the office, the teacher has just reinforced that behavior for them, and they will continue to interrupt because it gets them out of class. So that behavior is working for them. I get this question a lot. Is reinforcement bribery? And if you look up bribery in Webster's dictionary, it says that a bribe is something of value given to someone up front to coerce the person into performing an illegal or immoral act. Reinforcers are not the same as bribes. They're given as consequences, first of all, so that's a difference. And we're not asking people to do illegal or immoral acts, or I hope we're not, or we should never be doing that. And reinforcement, when it's used correctly, has been proven by a lot of research to be a critical component of the teaching process. So no, reinforcement and bribery are not the same thing. Okay, and this is just an example of what some positive reinforcers, some categories. So it could be getting a favorite food or drink. It could be favorite toys, access to preferred activities, social attention. A lot of times for kiddos, that is very reinforcing to get that verbal praise, those tickles, those hugs, especially for younger children. Being told that really like what you just did. If you get into more sophisticated reinforcement systems, you may be looking at using token systems or points, which are what we would call conditioned reinforcers. And the difference between these type of reinforcers is that these can be exchanged for backup reinforcers. So you get a certain amount of tokens, you can cash your tokens in, and maybe you get to go ride the bike. So some kiddos need that sort of structured type of reinforcement system in order to access their education. Another kind of reinforcer could be personal satisfaction, or what we would call, again, automatic reinforcement, because it's within the individual. The sense of accomplishment and the sheer pleasure in doing a good job. And I think we would all like our kiddos to be at this place where personal satisfaction is a reinforcer for them. But a lot of time with young kids, they're not there yet. So they may need to pair that sort of reinforcement with more social attention or with a preferred activity, with the hope that eventually we'll get them to that place where that intrinsic reinforcement will take over, but we may need to do some more extrinsic reinforcement before we can get there. Okay, so just some tips on how to use positive reinforcement appropriately and effectively. It's really important to provide the reinforcement immediately after your child engages in the desired behavior. That way, there's no question that that reinforcement is coming right after the desired behavior, and that's what is being reinforced. Sometimes if you have a lag between what the behavior was and then the reinforcer, it's not really clear. That connection isn't made clear to the child. So you want to keep it as immediate as you can. In the beginning, if you're teaching a new behavior, you want to provide the reinforcement each time the behavior occurs. And then you can gradually decrease the frequency of reinforcement as the child learns the new skill. So for example, my 6-year-old really had a hard time. He has some fine motor issues. He really had a hard time putting on his socks in the morning before school. And I was getting more and more frustrated because it was making us late. And I thought to myself, okay, behavior analyst, how can we teach this new skill? You obviously need to put in some reinforcement here to get him to engage in putting on his socks. So I started with, if he put his socks on in the morning within a certain time frame, he got a Pokemon card. Pokemon is his big reinforcer right now, meaning that that's something he loves and makes him very happy, and he's very motivated to get Pokemon cards. So get your socks on in the morning, he gets a Pokemon card. Now, obviously, I don't want to continue having to give him a Pokemon card every morning he puts his socks on, because that's a lot of cards. So after 2 weeks of doing that, then it faded out to 4 times a week when he did it. 4 out of the 5 mornings, he got a Pokemon card. Then it faded to 3, then it faded to 2, then it faded to 1, and now he just puts his socks on in the morning. We don't even talk about it anymore. It's just part of his routine. So that's an example of teaching the new skill, frequent reinforcement right on the heels of seeing the behavior, and then systematically fading out that reinforcer. And when possible, use those naturally occurring reinforcers. So if your child is one of these kiddos who has a hard time sitting at the dinner table, they're always, kind of ping-ponging and popping up and running around and coming back. If they sit at the dinner table for an entire, 10 minutes, then they have dessert. There's their reinforcer, if that's something that's reinforcing for them. So that's a naturally occurring reinforcer. That's something that would naturally occur in the routine anyway. So using those natural occurring reinforcers, we try to do that whenever it's humanly possible. That being said, there are some times, and with some learners, where we really need to use something external, with always the hope of pairing with the natural reinforcer. So ultimately, the natural reinforcer will take over for them over time. In the same way, we always try to pair social reinforcement, or what I would call verbal praise, with other types of reinforcers. So the goal is to make social consequences sufficiently reinforcing so they maintain newly learned behavior. So for me, when my colleague says to me, I really enjoyed what you just did, that was really great and I learned something, that's a reinforcer for me. That feedback is a reinforcer for me. So for our kiddos, we always want to, if we are providing, whether it be a special snack or a special toy or something, as soon as we see the behavior that we want to see increase, we're going to pair that with verbal praise and say, I really like how you just looked in my eyes when you told me that, or I really like how you're picking up your toys. Here you go, have a cookie, or whatever it is, so that eventually we can fade that tangible reinforcer. And since it's been paired with the verbal praise over time, the verbal praise should take over as the reinforcer. And another important thing to remember is technically it's not positive reinforcement unless the behavior actually increases. So this is a mistake that I have definitely made. That's an easy one to do. Don't just assume that something may be a reinforcer for a child. We are all different. And not only are we all different, but what is reinforcing for us can change over time. Something may be reinforcing for a child for a few months, and then they decide they don't really like Thomas the Train anymore. They like Paw Patrol, or whatever it may be. So we really have to make sure we are continually observing what the child goes for, likes to talk about, wants to do. We need to ask questions to get at interests. And we can always do what's called a preference assessment, which basically looks like putting a bunch of different toys or foods or whatever it is that you're working with on a table in front of a kiddo and see what they reach for. What do they want above all else? And there's a systematic way we do this, but that's the general idea, is just to make sure that we are working with the most potent, powerful reinforcers that we possibly can, so that we can be effective at teaching new skills and changing behavior. We can also use positive reinforcement to shape behaviors. So especially if you're working on teaching your kiddo a routine, such as putting on your coat, you can use reinforcement to reinforce small steps toward that larger goal. So this is where we would do, basically the jargon word would be a task analysis, but what that means is breaking down a task into small steps. So the first step may be pick up the coat. The second step, put your right arm in. The third step, put your left arm in. The fourth step, connect the zipper. The fifth step, pull up the zipper. The kiddo cannot put on their coat at all by themselves, and you're just starting from ground zero here. You may help them through all of the steps until they get to pull up the zipper. All you expect them to do is pull up the zipper by themselves, and then they'll get the reinforcement. Then once they can pull up the zipper, you would expect them to connect and then pull up the zipper. So they have to do the last two steps independently to access that reinforcement. Once they can do that, then you back it up again until you have them eventually doing that entire routine by themselves, but you are breaking it down for them to keep them successful, and you're reinforcing all those successive steps toward the final sequence. And a lot of times, especially with kids on the spectrum, we really need to look at tasks and break things down for them into very concrete units and teach a full routine, and we may be just working on pieces of it at a time, and eventually we get to the full routine. But we need to make sure that we are reinforcing all of those little successive steps to get there. Okay, this is one of my favorites, the Premack principle, or what we can call grandma's rule. So this is a principle in ABA that states that making the opportunity to engage in a high probability behavior contingent on the occurrence of a low probability behavior will function as reinforcement for the low frequency behavior. What in the world does that mean? Basically, in other words, when I was at my grandmother's, I may hear something like this: if you eat your green beans, you can have chocolate cake, right? So the high probability behavior is eating the chocolate cake. The low probability behavior is eating the green beans. If we put the low probability first, and if that happens, you can have the high probability, then you're more likely to have a child engage in that lower probability behavior. We do this all the time, and as parents, we do this all the time, I think. It's a good tool. It's what the first then, okay? So this particular visual for a kid may look like first you brush your teeth, then you get to play Legos, right? And so that's using that behavior momentum. The probability of that behavior occurring, of them wanting to play with the Legos, is high, so they're more likely to brush their teeth if they know the Legos are coming next. And you see this used in preschools. You see this tactic used a lot. I do this tactic for myself. If there's something I've been avoiding, like first I need to vacuum the house, then I can sit down and have a cup of tea. I make those contingencies for myself to make it more likely that I will engage in my lower probability behavior. So what about punishment? We've talked a lot about reinforcement. What about punishment? Punishment, as we said earlier with that chart, is a consequence that immediately follows a behavior and as a result decreases the probability of that behavior occurring in the future. So our reinforcement increases the probability of the behavior and punishment decreases the probability of the behavior. So for example, if Maggie lies to her mom about something, Maggie is given a timeout, which would be the punishment consequence, because this decreases her lying behavior in the future. Or John is late to school, so the teacher gives him extra homework. That extra homework served as a punisher because his lateness decreases in the future. One that often occurs is the child doesn't listen to the parent, so they lose screen time. The thought is that that listening behavior or not listening behavior would decrease in the future. So what is the deal with punishment? The deal with punishment is it's just not as effective as reinforcement. Mainly because it doesn't teach the child what to do. It tells them what not to do, but it doesn't focus on what they should do. And for some of our learners, it's really helpful that they understand what to do, and that is the focus. Also, punishment can have unintended consequences, emotional consequences, or sometimes the child can learn to avoid the person who provides the punishment, so that person may be somewhat aversive. So there's all these other sort of unintended consequences that can occur with punishment that don't occur with reinforcement. And so that's why reinforcement is always the preferred go-to method. Not that I'm saying that someone should never use punishment, because sometimes punishment is effective. I just think we need to be careful about it. Extinction. So this was that fifth category that we talked about before. And what that refers to is the process of decreasing behavior by removing reinforcement. So for example, if you have a child who would yell to get out of class, if you remove that reinforcer of being able to leave class and you just let the child yell and remove that reinforcement, that would be an extinction of that behavior, because you're removing the reinforcer that previously was increasing the behavior. You should only use extinction in conjunction with positive reinforcement for the desired replacement behavior. So we never want to just go in and try to extinguish a behavior. We always want to also be teaching a replacement skill, because they need to replace that behavior with something. They need to get that need met somehow. So for example, this used to happen to me a lot when my child was younger. Every time I would get on the phone to talk to someone, he would start screaming. So, of course, I would get off the phone quickly and engage with him to stop him from screaming. Continued. Every time I'd get a phone call, he would scream every time I would talk on the phone. So to extinguish this behavior, I consistently ignored him, withdrew that reinforcement of social attention when he was screaming when I was on the phone. And then when I wasn't on the phone, I would provide him with lots of social attention and also work on teaching him the appropriate way to ask for my attention. Mom, I want to tell you something, versus screaming when he wanted my attention. So that would be an example of the attention was reinforcing for him because I would get off the phone and pay attention to him. So I withdrew that reinforcer and worked on teaching him an appropriate skill. And eventually that behavior stopped. Other strategies that you can use when working with young kiddos is offering lots of choices. I think it's important for a child to feel like they have some sort of control in their environment and in their day. And so if we offer them lots of choices, then that helps with that. Also, to follow a child's lead. We want to be able to be sure that we are working in ways in which the child is really motivated and excited. And so we want to be following their lead whenever possible. Also, just keeping things simple. I think sometimes when we're dealing with behaviors or challenging behaviors, sometimes these plans get very convoluted and there's a lot going on. Sometimes we just need to really keep the expectations and the plans simple. And it's a lot easier for people to carry out, and it's a lot more realistic for staff to do. And this one is sort of a given, but just pay lots of positive attention to the child, what we would call non-contingent positive reinforcement. Which just means that, sometimes some challenging behaviors crop up in kiddos because they're seeking attention that they're not receiving at other times. So if we can find special times to give lots of positive attention, give that one-on-one to a kiddo, then that need to have those challenging behaviors to gain attention later in the day may not happen because they're already getting what they want. Providing plenty of access to preferred items, keeping things interesting, building appropriate communication skills is always something that we want to be working on and reinforcing in young kids. Pick your battles. It's a good one because I think that there are always going to be things that we think that we can work toward increasing, and sometimes we have to let some things go. So we kind of have to weigh what's the most socially significant behavior that we should try to work on right now. Because in reality, if you're trying to change behavior, you're probably only going to really be able to work on 2 or 3 behaviors at a time. If you try to work on everything at once, it's not going to go well, and you're not going to get the results you want. So I think you have to pick your battles throughout. And then the last one here is just to respect the child's right to be himself or herself. Some kiddos, we're all our special people, and some kiddos are more strong-willed than other kiddos, and some kids are more passive, and sometimes a lot of that is just kind of rolled into who they are in the genetic way. So celebrating and respecting those things that do make a child a unique individual, I think is important to keep in mind too. Okay, so we have a question here. It says, can you address at all when behaviors may be due to pain? That is a really good question. There is a special pain screening that can be used with special needs kiddos, since it may not be obvious that the behavior is pain related. I just had this one actually. Thank you for this question. I had a kiddo that came into our early intervention program who was having some really significant challenging behavior, nonverbal at this time, not a lot of functional communication skills. We did our ABC data. We were looking at what's going on, and we kept coming up with different functions. So there wasn't a clear function to this child's behavior. When you see that happening, it's really important to rule out a medical situation. I mean, and as we know, in kids who can't communicate very well, they could be in pain. They could be, it looks like this kiddo that she's writing about was due to a reflux problem that no one knew was reflux, which could be very painful. There's so many, it could be headaches. There's so many things that can be going on with kiddos. And so I always urge parents, and ethically, I feel like I have to rule out medical pieces when we see data come up like that just doesn't have a pattern and it doesn't make sense. Because to me, that says something is going on internally for that kiddo. So very good point. We always want to rule out the medical before we start an intervention. Okay, more questions. Let's see here. This is a good one. So 2 of my 3 children have autism. I'm trying to be a behavior detective, but it's hard since their behavior affects each other. Any advice? This is a good one. I think I actually work with a number of SIBs with both kiddos on the spectrum. And part of our treatment often involves, we see this a lot, where there are issues of behaviors that come up only when the siblings are together with each other. So what we do in that case, I mean, we go in and we actually look at do some observing of actually the kiddos together in that environment, take some behavior data, figure out what is reinforcing the behavior. And in that case, it's really helpful to, if you have a way to get a consultant to help you with that, I think that's the best thing that you could do. But if not, if you're looking at behaviors that they're both engaging in that are happening with each other, one thing that we've had some families do and have success with is to start a reinforcement system or a token system with both of the kiddos, so that they are each earning points or stickers or whatever you want it to be. It doesn't really matter what it is, by doing cooperative things together. So, you know, if they're able to both play with Legos, even if it's parallel play, just beside each other without any challenging behavior occurring, mom swoops in and says, oh my gosh, you guys are doing such a great job. I'm giving you each points for this. And then maybe when the kiddos earn a certain number of points, either together, it could be a plan where they're earning them together for an activity, like maybe they get to go to Good Air together, get air together. Maybe that's something the family really enjoys doing, that they can make contingent on the kiddos having those cooperative behaviors reinforced. Or if it's simpler to just, you know, each child could have their own separate thing that they're working for. But I think putting in a reinforcement system that's probably pretty systematic for those cooperative behaviors would be something I would try first. Let's see here. Oh, here's a good one. My son's school uses timeouts as a reinforcer in his behavior plan to the point where he isn't spending enough time in the classroom and is falling behind academically. What could I do? And I have seen this one before, where you see a kid that's spending a lot of time sort of in a room alone on break for extended periods of time. So I think what needs to happen with that behavior plan for that school would be that we need to look at a way to get participation in the classroom as the behavior we need to increase. We've taught them how to ask for a break. We've taught them, you know, this is a tool that you can use. However, now we need to turn the contingency around where his breaks are going to be contingent on him completing 1 to 2 tasks in the classroom. Then he gets a break. And then when he's doing that, then you can extend that to maybe 3 to 4 tasks. So you want to just make sure that that reinforcer is actually coming after the behavior you want to see increase, which would be doing things in the classroom. So, I mean, and that's the thing with behavior plans and behaviors, they change frequently. So at first, him being able to be able to get out of the classroom and have his self-regulation break and ask for that was very important. That was the behavior we needed to increase. Now he's got that. Now we need to look at where he needs to go next. And so making sure someone's looking at those behavior plans and thinking about what are the meaningful changes we need to make for a student, instead of just sort of having them coast through on this one behavior plan that's gotten kind of stale, and they're not really targeting the behaviors that that child really needs to increase in that moment because they've changed and they've grown. Oh boy, this is another good one. What can a parent do if they disagree with the school on the most important behaviors to focus on? This one is a tough one, but I think the first thing to do is to call that IEP meeting and make sure that everyone's at the table, and that you're able to be heard with the whole team on what you feel the most important behavior change would be for that student and for your child. Um, I would strongly suggest that you do bring an advocate with you. I'm a big fan of advocates, and I often refer parents to Vermont Family Network for that reason, because I just think it's helpful for parents to have a person that isn't there being paid by the school, but is there truly just to listen and support and help move things forward and help the conversation be productive. So that I would also suggest that happen as well. But I think if you can go back to that socially significant behavior, it's really hard to argue with the fact that I'm sure the behaviors of concern would be something that is very socially significant for that student, for that child. And once you get people in a conversation about that, it's really hard for people not to agree with that and move forward. But sometimes it takes bringing everyone together to get there and all be on the same page. Let's see here. Oh, this is a good question. So my son is nonverbal, so it's hard to know the function of his behavior or what would work best as a reinforcer. How do you approach ABA with children who are nonverbal? We do a lot of work with kiddos who are nonverbal. And the good thing about ABA is that it's really focused on what's observable and measurable. So even if a child can't tell you what they're thinking or what's happening in that moment for them, if you're observing them and seeing what they're doing, that behavior gives you a lot of information, and it can lead to figuring out what they're trying to communicate. In ABA with kiddos who are nonverbal, we work with a lot of visual supports. We have a number of kiddos who have AAC devices that we work with, that we collaborate with their speech language pathologist to figure out the best device, and all of those pieces. So yeah, ABA is pretty much approached the same way with all kids, except that mode of communication may be different for some kids, and the way that we communicate to them may be a little more visual for some learners than other learners, depending on what their understanding of language is. That's the key, I believe, is figuring out how much do they understand. Because sometimes a kiddo may not be able to express, but he understands a ton. And sometimes a kiddo may not be able to express and also doesn't understand a lot. And so that's very different than you do for him than you would do for a kiddo with a lot of receptive understanding. So, okay, well, one more question.
Sure.
I like this one. Are there any negatives to consider when using food, especially sweets, as a reinforcer? And I get this question a lot from parents as well. If you're using what we would call edible reinforcement or food with a learner, you should always have a plan for how you're going to fade that out. I try not to go there first, try to see if there are a number of toys or other tangibles that would work just as well. But sometimes with these kiddos, especially if they've had no intervention so far, and they come in and they're not motivated by a whole lot, the primary reinforcers, like the food, are the things that kind of jumpstart that learning. And we can teach them some foundational skills like how to pay attention, how to listen, those kind of things. And once we get them through that and they have those foundational skills for learning, then look at fading out some of that edible reinforcement and go for more activity-based reinforcers and natural reinforcers as much as possible. And it just really depends on the learner. Some kids come in and they have a wide variety of things that they're motivated by, a lot of different toys and characters, and they like to be spun around in the air or tickles. Great, we have all of that to work with. Sometimes we have a kiddo who doesn't like any of that physical play, who doesn't play with toys, who doesn't have any of those things. In that case, we may need to use, a few chocolate chips in the beginning to get them to look and listen and learn and be a learner, and then expand that repertoire of things that are reinforcing for them. But it's a good question, and it's, families have different preferences too, and we take all of that into account. Absolutely. Okay.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar. I encourage you to visit our website, which is vermontfamilynetwork.org, where you'll find resources, all of our upcoming webinars that will start again in September, and other events. We are going to save Molly's webinar and her PowerPoint on our website, and we'll also be uploading the video to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to talk with someone here at VFN, we'd love to hear from you. Our toll-free number is 1-800-800-4005. And I wish everybody a very good day. Thank you.